this is where my smart art failed me. I couldn't get like a circle going around a circle. But the learning cycle sort of wraps around everything. The EC principles and the core practices ground us, and then they go out to everything else. All right. So,
That's good stuff.
thanks, Kate.
Great vision.
I gave Steph a lot of feedback. And then she like made this awesome graphic, so it was like impossible to make. Thanks for hearing me.
I'm glad that you feel heard.
Not even student voices.
Okay. So this is the theory, and things are a lot of times all good in theory, but what it really comes down to is the way that we implement them in practice. And I don't know if you guys are like me, but I have trouble understanding really vision-heavy theoretical things until I understand how it's going to play out. And so that's sort of what I want to take you through now. And for each one, I want to open it up to questions that you guys are having too, to make sure that we're starting to get at some of those answers. Okay, so what does this look like in practice? I think another question is, won't this potentially make things more confusing? And honestly, the answer is potentially, it could. But that's why it's up to us to get this right, and that's why we're starting now, instead of just like throwing all this at you guys right before core members get here. And they are coming soon. So integration is key. Like I said earlier, whether we're giving a session, whether we're coaching, whether we're giving feedback, these are things that we want to refer back to. This common language is going to help core members situate their teaching and situate their experience and be able to express themselves to anybody, and especially to their coach. So we're going to go through a couple of examples of how we could integrate all of these things in practice. Okay, so session design. So the example I have up here is a read aloud. How could all three of these things be incorporated into the design of sessions? And I guess the execution of sessions as well. Alright, so for the learning cycle, if you're doing the read aloud session, right?
Totes.
Okay, so Kate's gonna open them up with a reflection on their own literacy experiences and their own experience with reading aloud, and that's gonna be where they ground everything. Then there's going to be a video model. You actually get to see all three of the reads, and then there will be other videos that they can access if they want to see different models. Then there's actually, I don't know if you guys remember this session, but there's time for practice, right? You actually get to open the books, you get to make your notes, and then core members they do their preparation, and then they actually get to practice for one another, right? And then, yeah, I'm sorry, that should have said Q2, not Q3. So yeah, they're getting the model, and then they're getting the practice time as well. So they're practicing in small groups, and then there's actually a big practice in front of everybody. So sorry, that's supposed to say Q2, not Q3. You guys remember the table discussions in? So one thing that all our table discussions in the past have been extremely repetitive. It's like, what does this say? What do you think? And it basically just asks core members to regurgitate what they've just learned. And so in order to up the rigor there and actually make it meaningful and impactful and interesting for people, we're going to try to include more rigorous table discussions. So we could incorporate a table discussion with the EC principles, actually calling out that difficulty I called out at the beginning, where someone might be feeling tension about valuing student voices versus asking them to be quiet and to listen. So we actually name those things and make people think about the difficulties that they might. But instead of just saying like, what do you think might be hard about this? Actually saying like, one of our principles is valuing student voices, and this could feel directly yeah, that's the word, intention with one of the things we learned about read aloud. What do you guys think about that? And then for the core practices, actually asking core members to go through a one-pager, the read aloud one-pager, and annotate what about whatever maybe our weekly core practice focus is. Positioning students' confidence and speakers, for instance. How's that sitting? Is that making sense? Yeah. Any questions? Any other things that you were wondering as you were learning about learning cycle?
I guess like I know that the core practices aren't hierarchical, but like how are we deciding the order in which we're like prioritizing like those sorts of discussions?
It's a great question. You want to take that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple of things. So the first couple weeks of summer training, when we're doing just the straight content sessions, we matched a core practice with each content that we felt like most what's the word I'm looking for? Aligned, yeah, thank you, with that core practice. Like what would be the easiest one to kind of discuss? So for example, like read aloud, like an easier one to discuss is eliciting student voices and responses, right? So that's how they're first being introduced to the core practice. Then in the weeks that follow, each week we'll have 1 to 2 core practices that we're like predominantly focusing on that week. So your video PLCs, a lot of our content sessions will start off thinking about and setting the stage with that core practice. In your specific coaching, that is totally up to you. Similar to like how you work with your MTLDs throughout the year, like together probably, and maybe with the help more at the beginning of the year with your MTLD, they kind of choose like, here's the biggest like bang for our buck, like this is the root of what's going on. That's kind of how we'll use the core practices. Since you guys don't have much practice with them, that's what we're going to be working on over the next several weeks. I don't really think there's ever a right or wrong answer. Like you probably feel this way in your classroom. Like sometimes you say like, okay, I think the root is in my planning. You work on your planning and then you're still having issue. Like maybe it's successful and you're like, that's great. I fixed my plans. Now everything's great. Or you're like, shoot, that wasn't it. We got to go back to the drawing board and figure out another cause for it. I would say like the same is probably true of the core practices. Would you guys add anything?
I think also like you can always be working on
Yeah.
all of the core practices, and in your individual coaching, you might be like, oh, this person really needs to work on eliciting student responses. But no matter if you're great at one or not great at another, like having a couple to focus on that week is still going to improve your practice. So like when we chose them per week, there's not super rhyme or reason.
Yep.
It's just like these are going to help ground.
Different parts of the day that you observe, like with different course. So like let's say you observe a read aloud and you see somebody, like a student says something and the core member responds to it so well, like eliciting and responding to student ideas. But then you notice like the teacher's really only just talking to the student, like teacher student, teacher student. So it's like they were doing a really great job of eliciting and responding to student ideas, but you notice that they really weren't orienting students to each other. So it's going to depend on like the need of the classroom, and you'll be able to, because you all, like all of you are excellent teachers, you'll be able to form that opinion, and that opinion is the thing that's going to guide you to use this tool.
And yeah, I think as you're going through it, as we continue to practice, we can continue to talk about like the tension or what are the things that are coming up out of the classroom video that you would think about, and then think about the different competencies, because I think in some ways there is a potential hierarchy to it, right? Like you're not necessarily you might want to start with that teacher like eliciting student responses before orienting to one another, right? Like if those student responses aren't there, then it wouldn't necessarily always make sense to go to that. And assessing student understanding is probably one we'll be light on this summer, because that's a more refined skill. That first you want to get them to be able to talk to 3-year-olds, then we'll get there.
Sure.
I think like the really great thing about this, and the reason that I'm like personally so excited about it, is it gives like you as a coach something to work with.
Yeah.
Like probably if you think back, like I know like my coaching with my core members is predominantly like, okay, like let's think about culture and rigor, and like we kind of have to make up like what is rigor, what is culture. Like you now have all of these things right here. And granted, like this is not like a box you can't go outside of course, but it at least like gives you a starting place without siloing, like Steph has been talking about, those out.
Let's actually move into coaching, because I think that's where we're going anyway. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, sorry that I'm just a creeper in the side. I'm Alex Fritzen, and I am the director of LT, so I'm supporting Haley and also just kind of like helping with the integration of BCE into the rest of our work. So I'm really excited to be here and hang out with you guys.
Alex is being so humble.
Yeah.
She's amazing, and Jordan and I have stalked her for the past month, like making her help us figure out how we're gonna do this. So she's wonderful and an expert. So
Alex
ask
was the
a lot
one
of
who
questions.
explained all of this to us.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Alex is like the circle at the beginning and then we're the circle.
Bigger, prettier, more awesome circle.
We're all awesome circles in this room. Okay. So going to coaching, the reason I have this is because we're gonna create like a tool for you guys to use. When I was at Institute, way back when it was still Institute, we used to get like a laminated towel rubric, and that would be like, you pull that out and you could use that for coaching. So you guys are gonna get something like that, and this could be like your launching pad. The way I envision it in my head is like if it were a virtual tool, like all of these things would be links you could click on. You can't tell where I'm pointing to each of the things. And then that would take you to, like if you clicked on the learning cycle, it would take you to this, and you could look at it more. So this is like the high level that you could use. And this is a tool that you can use when you're observing a classroom and prepping for a debrief. So when you're looking at what's happening at the student level, and when you're looking at what teacher actions are contributing to that, you're gonna formulate your opinion on what needs to change in this classroom in order for kids to have a better experience, to move forward, to learn, and for this teacher to become a better teacher. Once you've got that, and you will have, the reason that we have this structure is so that you have support in doing that this summer. So you're not just gonna be like, go, like Jordan was with lesson planning. Okay, write your lesson plan now. Okay, go give feedback. Like, we're gonna practice this. We're gonna support you. We're gonna join you. And you're gonna take ownership of it and feel more comfortable as the weeks go on. But the idea is that then you frame that feedback that you've come up with in a way that incorporates these things, these familiar pieces of language that core members can then situate in. So to give you examples of this, say you walk into a classroom and there are 3 kids playing tag, and like one's running under the tables and they're laughing and they're running. There are 5 kids wrestling on the floor. There's 1 kid crying and no one really knows what happened to her, but she's crying. And the rest of the kids are kind of wandering around aimlessly. Okay? So you walk into that classroom and you're like, ooh, there's a lot of things going on here. There's a ton of things you could fix, but how do you ground that feedback, right? You can start by going with the ECE principles, right? Safety first. That's got to be the number 1 priority. And that's where when you have that coaching conversation with that core member, you're going to ground them in that principle. And then it looks like if they're trying to execute a lesson like this, potentially they weren't prepared. So you can go back to Q2, like what broke down in this preparation? Or maybe it's Q1, right? They just didn't have a good enough model in order to get to Q2 to prepare. So that's how you frame that feedback for that core member instead of just like giving them a bunch of quick fixes, because that gives them something to do differently, but that doesn't explain the why of it. And to go back to your point earlier, like that doesn't help you then situate your experience more broadly. To give a different example, let's say you go into a classroom and a core member executes a read aloud flawlessly, and it's just like a beautiful thing and you're really excited about it, but then they're lining up their kids to go to recess, and you notice that they are like asking really low level questions of their kids, that they are like tying everybody's shoe for them, that they're like physically like positioning, like taking kids' bodies and positioning them when they're not in line correctly, instead of talking to them, and like this feels weird, right? This is not something that we want. And you've got this evidence that this teacher just executed a really good lesson, so they're, you know, at a high level doing something. So the way you might situate that feedback is like, I don't know exactly what's going on here, so I'm going to start in Q4 because I actually want to get at why this teacher is doing this. I'm going to ask them questions to specifically bring out, like, get them to reflect on that, get me to see if they notice that they're doing that, but also maybe potentially reflect on some biases that they might have about how kids should be and how they should be taught to move. And then from there, once you've got that information, moving into the idea of transferring power, that's an ECE principle, like how how that is actually not allowing them to get to that constructive place when they're like physically moving children. And positioning students as competent, right? Like when we're doing things for them, we're not positioning them as competent, and that's a core practice. So again, you've got that feedback you want to give, and you can give it through those lenses that they're already familiar with. And for an example like that too, like I know for me that's really like that can be triggering to see somebody do that with kids. And I know like you're going to be working with people this summer who are working with your students. And so that can feel really difficult. This is also like a calming tool for coaches. It can like, when you feel overwhelmed, it can give you a lens through which to see things. Is that helpful? Are those examples helpful? Okay. What other questions do you guys have about coaching?
Let's say we're in that situation of like the first example you gave where safety first.
Yeah.
How much do we sit back and kind of let it play out, and how much do we insert ourselves?
That I think I would like in that situation would communicate with the co-teacher who's in the classroom, because I would rather have them step in a familiar face for the kids than not. But that might lead you to a place when you're debriefing with that core member of like, do you want to co-teach this with me? Because remember, Q3 is not just you or the core member reflecting or teaching on their own. It can be a model where you're actually real-time coaching them or co-teaching with them. But yeah, that's a great question. Usually, you guys couldn't speak, but usually I like don't step in unless I see something dangerous like that happening. And I give a really extreme model, but yeah.
So in that example, you would maybe step in? Okay.
Yeah, and I would say to the core member, if no one else is in the room, I'd say like, hey, I'm gonna do this, I want you to watch me and join in with me.
For that, like for safety things, and that's almost getting into like some policies and procedures at school. So at a school level too, there will be like at each of the different school sites, there will be a policy about that, right? So like I will be meeting with the leader of GAD, so we're talking about like what is that, and then talking with co-teachers about at what point they will step in, at what point, so there will be some more of that conversation, and then on your level with core members, you'll also be talking about them, and like, this is what our coaching relationship looks like in a debrief, and when I'm in the classroom with you, these are those things too, so it should help give some clarity, so you're not like.
I'm gonna sneak back in a little while, guys, thanks for having me, and Steph, that was brilliant, I love that coaching, and you guys are great.
Hi.
Hi, Alex.
She's so affirming. She just comes in and affirms and then leaves.
Good job.
I love it.
That's a good question.
Can I add something on coaching?
I think this is exciting in using this language and helping this too, because I feel like one area that I want to grow as a coach is helping build up core members so that they can do more of the reflective and the work on their own. And I think we talk about that a lot, but these are giving really clear, cool tools that if we're using these and we're modeling them well and orienting core members to them, then I'm imagining core members in the middle of next year or like in the spring of next year, they're going to be able to be like, yep, I need in quadrant 4 work today, like today is the core practice was this and here's the thing, like where they're able to do it and lead more of the coaching conversations with the coach, or to be able to independently reflect and make changes in their classroom because they will have had a strong model of orientation towards the tools that they can now do.
Totally.
Cool.
Agree.
No pressure.
Reflective practitioners.
Transferring power.
Connections!
Highest level.
Dale, you're already on board. Look at you. You're already making
Gold
connections.
Sounds like I wrote these core practices in my sleep.
I read them right now. 4 years later.
Other questions that are, I'm sure they're like, sometimes I hate when people ask me if I have questions because I'm like, I know I do, but I don't know what they are yet.
Yeah.
So I don't want you guys to feel pressure, but I do want to make sure I'm answering them if you have them. Okay, so feel free to stop me if you do have questions. Okay, and then this part to me is like actually the most important because we can plan for the other things. Can't plan for these necessarily. So conversations have a huge potential impact, right? I'm sure we can all remember certain conversations in our teaching lives and in our regular lives that have had a huge impact on us. Like something someone said that sort of changed the way we think about things. or that like, you know, I'm sure we all have those examples. So they have an incredible potential, but there's also a big risk. If we're all answering questions in a different way, then, or if we're all answering questions that go back to different things, then core members could become confused. And I actually want to clarify that. We should all answer questions in a way that's authentic to us. But we should seek to also ground them in something that's familiar to core members. So, a couple examples here. I think these can also help us when we're faced with those tricky conversations, right? Like, there are some crazy things that core members can say. So the first example is like, okay, a core member, let's say she says it in a really sarcastic voice, and she's like, I don't even get why we need to have hooks for our lessons. It just seems really hokey to me, and like the kids aren't gonna buy into it. That's a real thing, right? A way that you could respond to that is by thinking like, okay, how does that connect back to what we already know, rather than just saying like, well, hooks are really important, they get kids interested, blah, 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 blah. You can say that, but by connecting it to something that she's already familiar with, by saying that like, hey, our research-based core practices that we know about actually say that positioning kids as competent and orienting them towards one another is a way that they internalize information. So if we're not starting out a lesson in a way that makes them think that we know that they know a lot of things, we run the risk of not actually being able to communicate information in the best way to kids. So yeah, and again, these posters will be up. There were many times that I was like looking at posters and being like, well, like it says over there, to help people situate. So, second example, core members like, I'm not gonna do the 3-read. Back to this example of conflict between the first read of a book where you're not supposed to ask kids questions and what he learned in seminar. So in this example, the sample response here, I think what you want to do is actually naming and acknowledging the tension, because this is probably coming from a place of confusion, and coming from a place of like just like feeling lost, but feeling very convicted about something. And actually, like, it's not a bad thing for someone to notice that tension. And so you want to like be able to name that and validate it, but then again, bring them back to something that's familiar. And in this example, you're actually co-constructing the answer, right? You're not giving them what they should do, but you're bringing them back to those principles and saying like, okay, you're naming this tension between valuing student voices and then orienting them towards content. What are some ways that we can come up with together that actually help make sure that we can do both in this lesson? And that, you know, makes it feel less like I'm giving you the answer, I'm telling you something you should do. It gives them the position, it actually positions them as competent, and again, brings them back to that familiar framework to hopefully help alleviate some confusion. And then the third example here, I had these lessons at Institute. I don't know if you guys had them. I've also had, well, I know you didn't have them. You did a great job at Institute. But Taylor would come in and be like, oh my god, that was terrible, and she'd like lay on the floor.
Taylor still does that.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
But you know that look, right? You know that look that they give when they're like, oh god, that was awful. And they felt so unprepared, I don't know what to do. And so, you know, you want to comfort them first. But then the idea here with this response is, again, you're situating them in that familiar territory immediately. Because that I don't know what to do is showing me confusion, right? That's showing me like that I'm totally lost. And to bring me back to familiar territory is immediately comforting and immediately helpful. And then that also like empowers me to help construct and find that way forward. So I'm like putting that learning cycle on and saying like, okay, we're reflecting right now, but what do you like? You know that Q2 and Q3 or Q1 and Q2 are really important to help with the execution. Do you think it's, you didn't have enough of a model? Do you think it's preparation? Like, what are your thoughts, eliciting those thoughts? They might say, like, I don't even know, and then you can help them further. But it might, and that's okay, right? But it might also give them a chance to immediately feel less lost and immediately feel like they have the power to make something better in what's feeling like an awful situation. And I think to Kitty's point earlier, like, this is then your ability to help them through that this summer is gonna position them well to be able to do that when they don't have a coach every day in the fall. And when they're gonna have to be making sense of things on their own.
I think there's also, I think you guys all know this, but like, to say it anyways, like there's also times where someone's gonna just feel so frustrated or so like out of it, they're not gonna be ready to do that yet. So you can also say like, we were gonna debrief right now, but clearly this is like, you need some space, or you need some like time to like think or like not think about this. Like, we wanna start in Q4 and reflect on this lesson together, but like in order for that to be productive, for us to get somewhere, you need to be in a place where you can do that. Like, go for a walk and then we'll have a shorter debrief. Like, be back in 5, be back, whatever. So I think when we think about that last example, there are definitely, it doesn't necessarily have to be like, okay, now here we're at. But.
Yeah. And I think there's a huge risk here too of this becoming like, oh my god, you're so TFA, right? Like, all of you are robots, you all use the same language. So one of the things we're gonna be helping you guys do is do this in a way that's really like actually you and not just like you spouting something off. Part of that is believing in this, so like getting you guys really familiar with the tools. But yeah, there's no one right way to answer any of these questions, but you do have a plethora of tools that you can use to help you. So that whether it's, Dal's core member, Asheen's core member, Taylor's core member, Katie's core member, no matter who it is, like I don't have to think, okay, like what are the things that Roshleen values, what are the things that her cohort's focusing on, and I have to run through all that in my head. I know that Roshleen's core members know these things, so I can give them some feedback within that.
Well, can we say we're so University of Washington? That's where these came from.
Nope. People like to call us robots. So this is bringing us to the end of this portion. I'm going to open it up for any questions. Yeah.
Alright, so you said that they're gonna have pre-work that kind of familiarizes them with all this.
Mm-hmm.
How is it that
Just
you're
the
like,
principles.
just the principles?
Yeah, not this or this.
Okay, how are they gonna be introduced to all this? Is that gonna be like right off the bat?
You're gonna do it, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tomorrow,
Well,
you
no,
call
that's-
all your core members.
A conference call.
Yes.
I'm
A
sorry.
WebEx.
It's my tendency to make a bad sarcastic joke.
Get used to it, Dal.
Mhm.
I'm just kidding.
No, but really,
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, but actually.
We're gonna have I can answer it real quick
Yep,
if you
do it.
want. Jordan and I are planning a session where we're gonna introduce all of these
Okay.
materials. And then kind of what I had shared with to Roshleen's question, not answer, I gave the answer, to Roshleen's question earlier, is that each session for the first 2 weeks is gonna focus on one core practice, and so core members can get more familiar with like, what does teaching towards an instructional goal actually mean? What does it look like? What are moves? Like, what are questions? All of those things. The first 2 weeks, and then in the teaching weeks, we're gonna like be diving into those more. And so I think just by like us using them, it's gonna be like an information session like this, and then by using them, that's how they're really gonna get to know them.
It's like and it's kind of like a gradual release of responsibility too. Like it's gonna be us presenting on them and then calling out connections like throughout those first couple weeks. And then when they start teaching, there's a shift when they start actually executing these on a daily basis, and then that reflection like comes in more into play than it has before. And actually this is great because we're about to do this as a group, go through a video PLC together through the lens of the core practices, which like staff will be facilitating, and that's where core members will start to kind of own that language for themselves and give each other feedback through that lens. But again, by the end of the summer, they're not going to be experts at this either. But the way that Kaylee described is how it'll be introduced.
Was that coming from a specific place? Do you have questions or concerns beyond that?
No, just kind of like related to the way beginning where I was trying to figure out like
How is
providing
this-
all that framework for them, like that this is kind of all going to be laid out right at the beginning. Like this is how we're going to be working through the summer.
Yes.
Like,
I think to Jordan's point, like we're going to be trying to call out and use the language much more frequently. Like our EC content sessions, you guys probably remember this, already pretty much follow the format of the learning cycle. So it's at this point just naming, like we're in Q1 right now. We're introducing new material to you. Like we're now in Q2. You guys are going to take time to practice and rehearse. Like we're in Q3, like that sort of thing. Just like actually using the language so they become more internalized on it.
That's a good question.
Yeah, great question. We're all still becoming familiar with it, like our EC regional staff, so don't like be overwhelmed. We're all in the learning game together. Cool.
And the last questions I have for you guys, what about this sort of framework of having these three things excites you? And what's still feeling like uncertain or difficult, or it might be a tricky thing?
I'm really excited about the core practices as like a framework for coaching, because I feel like I have been like, what do I do? And this is like a really nice like
We'll bleep it
Getting
out.
really excited here.
Other things feel exciting, difficult.
I'm happy to have all this. Like, this is like a good way to like understand like what we're doing and like all that.
Yeah, I think
I'm nervous about like coming up, pulling this out of my pocket when I need it. And just having that in my brain and knowing exactly what to say that makes sense to the core member. So it's something I'm gonna need to internalize.
Yeah, definitely. And we are definitely planning on ways to have practice with our group doing that, and then one-on-ones too for our adjustments.
I'm gonna start to work on, probably not using this exact language, because I don't wanna confuse core members who aren't really that familiar with it, but like using this in like coaching for this next month. Some of these, like actually just practicing with this as a tool. Could be, I mean, for you guys that are in the classroom, if you're reading through it and like, you could do like a little self-analysis of like, where am I on these things for your own things as well. That could be helpful in making it really personal to you and making it feel more authentic when you're giving feedback on it as well.
You could pretend to coach your kids. Be like, I'm positioning you as a confident
In all of these, I do want to, like, just selfishly, because I was in all of your interviews, you all just demonstrated these core practices and beliefs in these core practices, like, in the way that you talked about your own teaching and the way that you, like, participated in role plays. And so I just want to name that, like, you are living these out as teachers now. So I think it's about, like, recognizing that and, like Taylor said, like, internalizing what this means for you. But you all are already, like, doing so many awesome things that embody these, so.
We actually wrote these based on your classroom examples.
Cool. Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to Kales.